And it's based upon the one-word devotional book that several of you have purchased, which, by the way, if you haven't purchased that book, or if you haven't received your book that you wrote down that you wanted, we still have quite a few in the back office. And if you would make sure to get with the office and get with Amanda, and she can help you with that, because we want you to have the book that you subscribe to. And the whole idea, as we've mentioned before, is that this previous week, if you received your book, you would have gone through the several devotionals focusing on this one word that we have for the week, and it would bring up different aspects of that word. And then on Sunday nights, we'll bring up another lesson that brings up a slightly different angle having to do with it. And Roland said my sermon should be pretty short since I'm only saying one word, right? But unfortunately for you, that's not the case. Our word for this past week was simply the word "word." And if you did the devotionals throughout this past week, you might have looked at certain lessons like the word of power, and talking about how powerful the Word of God is. Passages like Hebrews 4 and verse 12 come to mind, where it talks about the Word of God being active and living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. Or maybe you did the devotional discussing the Word of life, in which God's Word gives life. It's life-giving, as Jesus said that His Word is spirit and life in John chapter 6. And so those are some of the lessons that you learned maybe in this past week. And continuing with that idea of word or words, it got my mind to thinking about one of the most unsettling passages in the Gospels that I can think of. One of the most unsettling things for me that Jesus ever said. And it's found in Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 and 37. If you want to be turning your Bibles there. Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 and 37. Actually, we'll go ahead and start in verse 35 of Matthew 12. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasures brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word that man may speak, they will give an account of it on the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Now, I don't know about you, but that's very unsettling to me. That troubles me a little bit. Mainly because I'm an extrovert and I say a lot of words. And Jesus says you're going to be judged by idle words. Words that have no purpose. Words that show a different evil intention, because He connects our hearts with what we say. Words that hurt people and harm people. Words that do wicked things and do evil things. And He says it's not simply about your actions and things that you do, but in fact, God's going to hold you accountable for the things that you say. And that really, really troubles me. But when I think about that idea of being judged for our words and being mindful of what we say, and continuing this thought of word and words, I can't help but turn to James chapter 3. Because if we're going to be mindful of our words, if we're going to try and do a better job of guarding our words, of making sure that we're leading them in the way we want them to be led, then I think that we need to go to James chapter 3 to discover some of those answers. James chapter 3. I appreciate Parker doing such an excellent job of having songs having to do with words tonight. He did a really good job with that. In James chapter 3, I want us to start in verses 1, and we'll go through verse 4. My brethren, he says, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, there's our word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at the ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot directs it. You know, when I think about our words and our tongue, as James talks about here, there's three things I want us to discuss tonight from this text that will hopefully help us to better control ourselves when it comes to our speech and to our words. And number one, we need to realize that often our words take us in a direction that we never meant to go. Our words take us in a direction that we never meant to go. James says, he starts off by saying, you need to realize, don't strive to be a teacher. And what he means is, don't strive too many of you to be teachers and try and run over each other to try and be teachers. He says, because a teacher is going to be held to a stricter judgment because of the words that he speaks before the congregation of God's people. And he says, in reality, that should cause you to tremble because your tongue, it's a very small member of your body. It's not very large, and yet it has an incredible amount of influence on the direction of your life. He says, look at the horses. Horses are great, powerful creatures. What do we do to turn them? We put a bit in their mouths. You look at the ship, massive ships. What turns them? A small rudder. You probably have friends or family members whose direction, the direction of their life, has been altered in a great and significant way, probably not for the better, simply because of something they said to someone else. Maybe it was a careless word that they said to someone in confidence that they probably shouldn't have said. Maybe it was an angry word that they said to their boss. Maybe it was a word of bitterness that was spoken to their spouse. How many words throughout the course of your week change the direction of your life? You start off the day and it's going well. Starts off very happily. Starts off with great joy and great purpose and great direction. You're thinking, this is going to be a great week. And how often does something that someone else said and something that you say change the direction and the course of that spirit and the course of your week? James says the reality is that if we're not careful, our words are going to lead us to a place that we never intended to be. In fact, we sometimes will say that, don't we? When we get in the midst of a conversation, maybe we have to talk to someone about a sensitive subject and we say something and all of a sudden they become very hostile and all of a sudden it takes a turn for the worst. And what do we say? This is not where I thought this conversation was going to go, right? This is not where I envisioned this conversation going. And so James says that you need to be aware of the fact, don't carelessly go into conversations. Don't carelessly engage people and think, well, it doesn't really matter what I'll say. And a lot of times I have to be careful about that because I say, well, I'll wing it, right? You ever said that? I'll wing it. And I've come to realize that important conversations, they take deliberate forethought to make sure that you're careful about the exact words that you say. And so how do we curb this? How do we help this to make sure that our words don't lead us to a place we never meant to be? Well, we have to lead our words and not be led by our words. We have to lead our words and not be led by our words. And again, that takes forethought. That takes a proactive mindset that says, you know what, I'm going to make sure if I'm talking to someone, especially about something sensitive, that I'm not going to use this word, that I'm not going to make them think I'm accusing them of something. You have to be mindful of where you want this conversation to go. You have to help that person to see that you're here because you want the best outcome for your relationship. You want them to know that this conversation isn't just about helping you, it's also about helping them. That you have a shared partnership in the direction of this conversation. Listen, so-and-so, I don't want you to feel like I'm accusing you of something. I want you to know how much I appreciate you. You have to lead your words, by the way, with kindness and with grace and with love. Lead your words with words that will help. I'm not talking about flattering someone. Say things that you genuinely mean. Tell them, listen, I appreciate the way that you live your life. I appreciate your love for the Lord. I appreciate all that you've done for me. And it's because I appreciate you, I've got to talk to you about something that's kind of difficult to talk about. Allow your conversation to be led with graceful words. A lot of times when we're hurt, when we're angry, when someone has hurt us, how do we lead our conversations? Hey, I want to talk to you. Right? I want to talk to you. That's always a good thing to hear, right? I've never had a conversation that began that way end well. I want to talk to you. Who do you think you are? We often lead our conversations in a way that automatically, our life was going one way and those few words turn it in the wrong direction. But what's great about a bit and what's great about a rudder is that it doesn't have to stay in that same direction. Even in a conversation that's gone off course, it can still be turned back to where it needs to go if we're willing to have enough self-control and wisdom and patience with people. But we have to be mindful of the fact that our words often will lead us to a place that we never thought we'd be. Number 2, our words destroy more than we could have ever thought. Our words destroy more than we could have ever thought. Look at verses 5 and 6. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and set on fire the course of nature, and it is set on the fire by hell. Our words can destroy more than we could have ever thought. Have you ever been a part of maybe a campfire, or maybe you're cooking something and all of a sudden something catches on fire? And it's just a little bitty small fire, but then it starts to spread a little bit. There is nothing more terrifying than having that happen. I remember a couple of years ago when we were shooting off some fireworks around this area, and there wasn't a ban or anything, but it was July 4th and we were shooting off fireworks, and all of a sudden there was some fire on the ground. Y'all remember that? It was over here when we were shooting it, and it kind of started to spread a little bit, and I wasn't over there. I was watching, and I thought, oh, well, that's odd, and then all of a sudden you're thinking, oh, wow, that's continuing, and it's a little bit scary, and fire just spreads so quickly. We've seen the damage that the fires have been caused in California and all the damage that's caused there. Have you ever seen how destructive a simple word or a simple sentence can have on the lives of other people? A loose word of slander or gossip, a word of anger. A single sentence and a single word of anger has so much power that it can keep a father from speaking to his son for 25 to 30 years. I've seen it happen. A single outburst of anger and a word spoken. Friendships. People have been friends for 20 or 30 years, and all of a sudden they find out that friend said something about them to someone else, and it's broken. A lot of times we like to say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. Whoever made that up was just dumb. I mean, they were dumb. I don't call people dumb very often, but that's dumb, because we know that that's not the case. We realize that some of the most hurtful, some of the most painful moments that we've experienced in our life have been the words that people have said to us. In fact, I could probably ask you tonight, what were some of the most damaging things, the most hurtful things that someone has ever said to you? And I bet you could call them up right then and there. On the flip side of that, I could probably ask you, what are some of the most encouraging things that someone has said to you? And you could probably call those up as well. Why is that? Because words are powerful. They have a great power for strengthening and for building up, but they also have a great power for destruction. And so how do we curb this? How do we guard against this tendency to destroy things in our lives by our words and how we speak to one another? Well, there's 2 ways. Number 1, we have to be mindful of our tendencies. We have to be mindful of our tendencies within conversations. All of us get in habits of how we talk. All of us get in habits of different ways that we conversate with people. The words that we use and the things that we say and the bad habits that we have. And what we have to do if we're going to guard against the destructive force of the tongue and against the destructive force of our words is we have to do some self-examination. And we have to see what are some bad tendencies that I have that help to break down the conversation, that help to turn the conversation in a bad direction, and that help to cause destruction in my life. Looking back over our lives, we can all have moments where we look at a conversation and we say, oh man, that took a bad turn. What did I do here that I could have done better to help turn it in a better direction? It requires a lot of self-reflection, a lot of self-examination. We have to be mindful of our tendencies. And one of those tendencies, number 2, that we have to be mindful of, and I think this is a big one here that we sometimes forget, is our tone. We have to be mindful of our tone. I sometimes joke, does anyone in here know how to speak German? A little bit? Keith, a little bit? Roland, a little bit? I always joke about how everything that's said in German always sounds angry, right, to me. You can say, I love you, and it sounds like saying, I love you, right? It always sounds a little bit angrier to me. And so, but yet they might be saying something that's very kind and loving. You ever have that happen? I know sometimes as a husband and a father, I can struggle with that. And you're saying something to somebody, and then all of a sudden you're kind of seeing them wilt. Maybe your kids wilt a little bit underneath you, and you say, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting that way? Well, honey, you're being kind of rough on them. I didn't say anything mean. No, it's not what you said, but it's how you said it. And don't be deceived into thinking that doesn't matter. You can, listen, as a preacher, sometimes I have to talk to people about some very difficult things. And I have to say some very difficult things. But you know what's incredible to me is people are much more willing to accept those difficult things when you say it with kindness and gentleness and love. You want to get your point across? You want to get something pushed through, whether it's at work, whether it's in your family, whether it's in your church life, you need to be mindful of how you say it to people. To make sure that it's given with sweetness and with grace, as Paul says in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, to let your speech always be seasoned with grace. You're giving people what they don't necessarily deserve when you talk to them. That means that you're granting them something. You're granting them kindness and a gentle tone, even when they might not necessarily deserve for you to talk to them that way. But what you're doing when you're mindful of your tone is you're helping to curb the destruction that your words might cause if you're not careful. That is one of the greatest tools that we can have in engaging people in conversations. And allow your friends to tell you, hey, I know you're meaning to say this, but the way you're saying it sounds pretty aggressive. I've had friends tell me that. And it's helped me. It's helped me immensely to be mindful of that, because I wasn't mindful of it beforehand. And it helped me in my conversation. So, our words take us in a direction we never meant to go. It destroys more than we could ever have thought. And number 3, our words are often more toxic than we ever intend. They're more toxic than we ever intend. Start in verse 7 with me. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessings and cursings, my brethren. These things ought not be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water, and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt and fresh water. Again, you can almost see, if you're watching friends get into an argument, or spouses get into an argument, or co-workers get into an argument, you can almost just literally, physically see the moment when that relationship is poisoned by something that one of them says. You can see it on their faces. That moving forward, this relationship isn't going to be the same anymore. Because it suddenly has been poisoned by slander, by gossip, by bitterness, by hateful words that have been spoken. And James says the reality is that the tongue is a deadly poison if it's not used properly. He said, now it can bring forth springs of living water, but it can also bring forth bitter water. It can bring forth great fruit, but it can also bring forth thistles and thorns. And going back to what Jesus said earlier in Matthew chapter 12, your speech is going to be a reflection of your heart. What comes out of here is directly connected to what's coming out of here. And Jesus says that's the connection. That's why you're going to be judged by your words, because you're not going to be able to stand before God on Judgment Day and say, well, Jesus, that wasn't really me. Jesus will say, no, that's the problem here, Jacob. It was really you. It was really you. So what can we do to guard against this toxic poison of the tongue? What can we do to inoculate ourselves from this poison of the tongue? We inoculate it in 3 different ways. Number 1, we inoculate it by consistency. We inoculate it by consistency. Notice he says that a fountain can't bring forth bitter and sweet water. A tree can't bring forth both fruit and thistles and fruit and thorns. It needs to be consistent. We need to be consistent in our speech. What we say to someone, about someone, needs to be the same thing that we would say to their face. If I'm not willing to, am I willing to say this to them in person? Am I willing to talk to them in person about this? Am I being consistent in how I'm presenting different events and how they occurred to people? Or am I presenting it with a slightly slanted view to someone else? If we're honest, we all do that. We all do that. We're not nearly as consistent as we need to be in our speech, and that causes problems. In fact, the Bible calls that, and later James will say in James chapter 4, it calls it being double-tongued. You have 2 tongues. You have one tongue that talks one way to a certain group of people when they're around, and then you have another tongue that talks to another group of people when they're around. But those 2 tongues never meet. You are to have a singular voice and consistent speech. And the only way that we can guard ourselves against the poison of our words is to be consistent in how we talk to people. Number 2, the way that we inoculate ourselves against this poison is to have character. To have character, to have integrity. To be a person that recognizes that not everyone is always at their best, that people make mistakes, that you've made mistakes, that you've done and said things that you hope and pray to God they don't talk to other people about, that you and your weaknesses have done terrible things, and you really hope that people don't hold that to your account. You need to be a person of honesty and integrity and character, to where people know that if they slip up in front of you, they don't have to worry about coming to you and saying, please don't tell that to somebody else. Please don't say that to someone else. Or if they confide in you about something very personal, they know that it's going to be kept between you and them alone. I've had friends that I go to, and there's other people that I might say something to, and I might come back and say, hey, would you make sure to keep that just between us? But there's other friends that I go to, I don't have to say that. Why? Because I know they're a person of character. And I know that they realize the sensitivity of what I just told them, and they're not going to let other people know about that. Be someone that's a person of character that's not going to open the vault of someone else's secrets that they've confided in you. That's what friendship is about. So be consistent, be a person of character, and thirdly, show constraint. Show constraint. A lot of times, again, there's just a habit that we have of maybe wanting to say things that we shouldn't say. To say words of anger and bitterness. And a lot of times, we even say something. This is how difficult it is. And again, this is what James is talking about. Very little member of your body here, the tongue, but it's very difficult to control. And you know how I know it's difficult to control? Because when we really struggle to say something back to someone that's maybe vindictive or hurtful, what do we say? I literally had to bite my tongue. Now, sometimes we say that metaphorically, bite your tongue. I have literally had to bite my tongue in my life before to keep from saying things to somebody out of vindictiveness and anger. And it's a way of holding yourself back and constraining yourself. That's what James is talking about. This is how difficult it is. You literally have to do yourself physical harm at times to keep yourself from lashing out at somebody. Bite your tongue. There's a lot of different proverbs we have. You don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. We have all these little proverbs. We realize the power of words and the importance of constraint. Here's a great revelation that I have come to, and I think that all of us need to come to. Our commentary, our words, our opinions are not needed on every single thing in life. You know, people will be completely fine if they don't hear your opinion about every single thing. Now, I'm not saying don't have an opinion. I'm not saying don't speak your opinion. I don't like that either. I don't like saying, well, we all just need to be quiet and seek peace and never have an opinion about anything. No, I don't agree with that either. But I do think we need to realize that there's moments where we need to show a little bit of constraint and realize who we're talking to, where we're talking to them, the environment, and what purpose is this going to serve. All of those need to play into whether or not we actually say something in that given moment to that particular person and for that particular reason. So these are certain things that we need to be aware of, that our words can take us in a direction that we never meant to go, that they can cause far more destruction than we ever thought they could, and that they can be far more toxic than we ever intended. But the beautiful thing is that God is patient with us as we strive to tame our tongue, as we try to sanctify our words for the use of Christ and His church. Think about this. As you go throughout your week and you think about this idea of word and words, in what way this week are you going to use your speech to glorify God? What can you do this week that you didn't do the week before to build someone up, to say something encouraging to them, to speak truth to them, to be a word of comfort to them if they're hurting? And it might simply be constraint in dealing with a coworker or dealing with a spouse. That principle that Peter talks about where he says in 1 Peter chapter 2 that Jesus was reviled, but He did not revile in return. He was reviled, but did not revile in return. Does that not apply to our marriages? Does that not apply to our closest relationships? That if my spouse says something to me that's a little bit bitter or a little bit hard or a little bit difficult, that I don't turn around and lash back out at them immediately? Or to my children or to my parents? To my friends? In what way can we have Christ-exalting words in this coming week? That's your challenge for this week. And if you have the devotional book, you notice there's little daily challenges there. Today I will ... and it gives a little challenge. So this week, today, what will you do to make sure that you guard your words and that you give them to Jesus for His glory? Tonight, you might have a need to respond to the invitation to ask for the prayers of your brothers and sisters in Christ because you struggle with this very thing. And we want you to do that. We want you to know that we struggle with it as well, but maybe you need an extra measure of encouragement and prayer. Whatever your need is, why don't you come as together we stand and as we sing.